Red Army by Ralph Peters. Chapter 3. Nobody wanted to touch the body. The soldiers stood around the corpse in the drizzling rain, staring. The rain tapped at the open, upturned eyes and rinsed the slack mouth under the glare of the lantern. Bibulov, the warrant officer who had been left in charge of the vehicle transloading, tried to remember the soldier's name. He recalled that the boy was a Tadzik, but the elusive Asian consonants of his name escaped him, teasing just beyond his mental grasp. The boy had come to the unit unable to speak any Russian beyond the primitive sounds necessary for survival, and all of the prissy, well-intentioned efforts of the Language Skills Collective had not brought him to proper speech. The boy had done as ordered, imitating when he did not understand, and had waited as mutely as a resting animal between jobs. It seemed to Bibulov as though the boy had set his mind to endure the 2 years in uniform required of him with the minimum of personal engagement, to do as he was made to do, uncomplainingly, until it came time to return to his distant home. Now he was dead, and the war had not even begun. Bibulov believed that there would, indeed, be a war, and that it would come soon, but now there was only the frantic shifting of cargoes in the middle of the rainy night. The guns had not yet begun to squander their accounts of ammunition, yet the boy was absurdly dead, as though fate could not wait a few more hours or another day. Bibulov shook his head, attempting to select the correct response, the course of action that would result in the least trouble. Somehow, it was in the natural order of things, if not this, then something else. The premature death accorded with Bibulov's view of the world and of his own place in it. What more could reasonably be expected? And what did they expect, when exhausted soldiers were detailed to transload the unwieldy crates of artillery charges and rounds in the rain, with their bare hands, without even the most rudimentary tools? It seemed to Bibulov as though nothing of significance had changed in 100, perhaps 1,000 years. Oh, there were the trucks, of course. The big trucks from the Army Material Support Brigade brought the cargo from the Army's forward supply base to the transshipment point at Division. Then, brute strength. Wet, splinter-riddled hands shifted and hoisted and lugged the stone-heavy boxes through the mud to the smaller trucks of the artillery regiment or to the shuttling division carryalls. The trucks were fine, but between the full and empty trucks lay a pool of timelessness, where animal labor continued to dominate. Bibulov had watched helplessly in the muted glow of the safety lights as the unbalanced crate began to slip. It started with a fatal shift on the shoulders of weary boys. Then it proceeded relentlessly, a dance of silhouettes, as the crate slowly edged forward, quickening, then dropping, very fast as the struggling boys abandoned it one after the other in a swift chain reaction. At the climax of the brief drama, the Tajik was a last tiny shape, twisting in a moment's terror and sprawling backward under the weight, padding its fall with his chest. By the time they heaved the crate off to the side, the boy was dead. Bibulov tried to get the thing in perspective. The rain licked at the back of his neck. How big an event was the boy's death now? In a training exercise, everything in the unit would have come to a halt, but events had moved fatally beyond training exercises. The inevitability of war had come home to him the evening before, when the responsible officers had suddenly stopped demanding signatures of receipt on their delivery inventories. Bibulov had never known such a thing to happen, and it jarred him profoundly. At the same time, the grinding pace of the past few days had increased to an inhuman tempo. Bibulov decided that, although the boy's death was undoubtedly a very significant event to somebody, somewhere, there was nothing to be done about it here and now, and the cargo had to be transferred. He stared down, tidying up his conscience with quick last respects. The corpse appeared ridiculous and small, an ill-dressed doll. The flat Asian face shone in the cast of a lantern as though the rain had polished it with wax. "Pick him up," Bibulov ordered. "We're wasting time." When the soldiers responded merely by shifting their positions, milling a little closer as each one waited for another to begin, Bibulov hardened his voice. "Pick him up, you bastards! Let's go!" It was always like this, Bibulov consoled himself. The big men decide and there's nothing to be done but obey, hoping you're not the one who gets crushed in the mud. Shilko woke abruptly in response to the careful hand on his shoulder. Has it started? He asked, with the urgency of disorientation. Before Captain Romolinski could respond, Shilko had gained sufficient mastery of himself to realize that everything was still as it should be, and that his big guns had not yet begun their work. The only sounds were the dotting of rain on the roof of his range car and the background noise of vehicles in movement that had not ceased for days. The local area had its own little well of rain quiet. The battalion was ready, waiting. Sleep well, Comrade Commander? Romolinski asked. Shilko liked his battalion chief of staff. Romolinski was wonderfully earnest, an officer of excellent staff culture. It had been no plum for him to be assigned to a battalion whose commander obviously was not soaring through the ranks like a rocket. Lieutenant Colonel Shilko was easily the oldest battalion commander in the high-powered artillery brigade, perhaps in the entire 2nd Guards tank army. He was, in fact, older than the new breed brigade commander, but if Romolinski felt any disappointment at his assignment, he never let it show. The captain was a good officer and a fine young man. Shilko wished that his daughters had chosen husbands more like Romolinski. Sleep, Vasily Rodionovich, Shilko said, moving his tired body into the seat and drawing up his reserves of good humor. I slept like a peasant when the master isn't looking. What time is it? 2:00. Shilko nodded. Always punctual, Vasily Rodionovich. But I'm keeping you out of the rain. Go back inside. I'll join you in a moment. Romolinski saluted and trotted off toward the fire control post. Shilko shifted in the seat, wishing he were younger, or at least wore a younger man's body. His kidneys ached. He had slept only a few hours, but it had been the plunging, hard sort of sleep that wants to go on for a long time. The preparations for war had exhausted most of the officers and men. What effect would war itself have on them? Despite his seniority, Shilko had never been to war. Instead, his son had gone to Afghanistan as junior lieutenant, fresh from the academy, and he had come back after only 4 months, with neither his legs nor a career. Shilko continued to be haunted by guilt, as though he had sneaked out from under his responsibilities intentionally, sending his son in his stead, although that certainly had not been the case. Beating his returned son for the first time in the military hospital with the Medal for Combat Services and the Order of the Red Star pinned to his pajamas, and the bottom half of the bed as flat as the snow-covered steps, had been the most painful experience in Shilko's life. Overall, he counted himself a lucky man. He had a good wife, and they had had healthy children together. He had work he didn't mind, and he enjoyed the personal relationships that developed in the small unit families where he spent most of his career. He had never expected to be a marshal of the Soviet Union, recognizing even as a young man that he was not cut out for special honors. So he simply tried to do that which was required of him as honestly as possible, content to be at peace with himself. His daughters had always seemed like the real fighters in the family, and it seemed to him as though they only married so they would have new opponents against whom to try their tempers. He could not understand it. His wife, Agafya, was a fine, big, happy woman, well suited to him, but the girls were an untamed, greedy pair. Perhaps, Shilko thought, trying to be fair, Romolinski was much better off just as he was. Pasha had been different from the girls. He had excelled at sports, but had not been overly proud, with nothing of the bully about him. All things considered, he had been a kind boy, and decent to the girls. He had never given Shilko any serious trouble, and he had done well enough at the military academy. Shilko had been proud to see the boy off to Afghanistan, although ashamed that he himself was staying behind. Then Pasha had come back, missing parts. The boy had stubbornly tried to make it in his own, but the reception for the Afghancy was not a good one. Shilko could not understand what was happening to the country. Instead of being respected, veterans were ignored, or even mocked and slighted. Pasha had been denied ground-floor living quarters despite his handicap, and although such an allocation had been easily within the powers of the local housing committee, and as Pasha himself bitterly told it, when he complained about the low quality of his prosthesis to the local specialist, the doctor had replied, "What do you expect me to do? I didn't send you to Afghanistan." The prosthesis had not changed much since the Great Patriotic War over 40 years earlier, but something in the spirit of the people had changed. No, Shilko had told himself. That was probably incorrect. Even the Great Patriotic War had undoubtedly its little human indignities and examples of ugliness. That was human nature. Yet, somehow, there was something wrong. Shilko fitted his cap to his head. He avoided wearing a helmet. He valued small comforts, and he was conscious of how foolish he looked with his big peasant face and potato nose under the little tin pot. He had no illusions concerning his appearance. He had grown fatter than he would have liked, and he would never appear as the hero in anyone's fantasies, but that was all right, as long as he didn't look like a complete fool. He swung his legs out into the slow drizzle, then grunted and huffed his body out of the vehicle. He stood off to the side for a moment, relieving the pain in his kidneys. Then he moved toward the shelter of the fire control post at the pace that compromised between his desire to get in out of the rain and his body's lethargy. Inside, behind the flaps of tentage, the little control post was bright, crowded, and perfumed with tobacco smoke. Shilko felt instantly alert, comfortable with the reassuring sensory impressions of a lifetime's professional experience. The feel of the place was right, from the pine branches spread over the floor to keep the mud at bay, to the intense, tired faces and the iron smell of the command and control vehicles that formed office compartments to the edge of the tentage. The crew snapped to attention. Shilko loved the small tribute, even as it always embarrassed him a little. "Sit down, comrades. Sit down." A sergeant bent to draw tea from the battered samovar, and Shilko knew the cup was for him. They were all good boys. A good team. "Your tea, comrade battalion commander?" Shilko took the hot cup lovingly in both of his big hands. It was another of life's small, wonderful pleasures. Hot tea on a rainy night during maneuvers. The army couldn't run without its tea. He caught himself. It wasn't a matter of maneuvers this time. He stepped into the Fire Direction Center vehicle and bent over the gunnery officer's workstation, where a captain with a long wave of hair down into his eyes poked at the new automated fire control system. "And how are we progressing, Vladimir Semyonovich?" The captain looked up. His face had a friendly, trusting look. It was the sort of look that Shilko wanted every one of his officers to have when their commander approached. "Oh, it will all sort out, Comrade Commander. We're just working out a few bugs in the line. The vehicles keep cutting our wires, but the battery centers are each functional individually." Shilko put his hand on the man's shoulder. "I'm counting on you. You can't expect an old bear like me to figure out all this new equipment." Although he said it in a bantering tone, Shilko was serious. He understood the concept involved and what these new technical means theoretically offered, and he was willing to accept any help they could give, just as he was ready to lay them aside if they failed. But he was personally frightened by the thought of sitting down behind one of the forbidding little panels and attempting to call it to life. He suspected that he would only embarrass himself, so he gladly let the young men pursue the future, and when they performed well, he was grateful, and he encouraged them to go on attacking the problem. He approached his battalion chief of staff, Romolinsky, and a lieutenant sat bent over the field desk covered in manuals, charts, and loose papers. The lieutenant worked on a small East German-made pocket calculator that always seemed to be the most valuable piece of equipment in the battalion. Romolinsky looked up. Shilko knew the man's expression well enough to know that, beneath the staff discipline, Romolinsky was frustrated. "Comrade Battalion Commander," Romolinsky said, "no matter how we do it, the numbers will not come out right. Look here. If we fired every mission assigned under the fire plan, as well as the projected number of response missions for the first day, we would not have fired more units of fire than we have received under our 3-day allocation, but we would not even have the time to physically do it. The division's expectations are unrealistic. They're not used to working with our type of guns. They think we can deliver the sun and the moon. Well, Vasily Rodionovich, we'll do our best. If we were to fully conform to the tables, if we use the normative number of rounds per hectare to attain the designated level of suppression or destruction for each mission they've assigned us, it just wouldn't come out. The numbers refuse to compromise." "Everyone wants the big guns," Shilko said. Then in a more serious tone he asked, "But we can meet each phase of the initial fire plan?" Romolinsky nodded. "We're all right through the scheduled fires. And the rest," Shilko said, "is merely projection. We're looking at minimum projection figures." Don't worry, we'll manage. If they keep dropping off ammunition the way they've been dumping it since yesterday, we may end up with too many rounds and not enough vehicles to move it when we displace. But the matter of the physical inability to fire the missions within the time constraints. Shilko appreciated Romulinski's nervous enthusiasm. He liked to have a warrior as a chief of staff. I have confidence in you, Shilko said. You'll make it work, Vasily Rodionovich. Now tell me, has Davidov gotten his battery out of the mud yet? Romulinsky smiled. There was a slight rivalry between Romulinsky and Davidov, and Shilko knew that the chief of staff had been amused at Davidov's embarrassment. He had delighted in helping the battery commander recover his bogged guns as publicly as possible. He's out and in position, but he was in a heat. We teased him a little, you know. Getting one gun stuck may be an accident, but getting an entire battery mired begins to look like a plan. He still hasn't calmed down completely. Shilko stopped smiling for a moment. He truly did not like their fire positions. The terrain over which they had been deployed seemed like a German version of the Belarusian marshes. You had to go carefully, and there were areas where you absolutely could not get off the roads. The precious little islands and stretches of reasonably firm ground were absurdly overcrowded. His own guns were too close to one another, batteries well under 1,000 meters apart, and still their position was not completely their own. A chemical defense unit, which, to Shilko's relief, appeared utterly unconcerned about the war, and an engineer heavy bridging battalion had both been directed to the same low ground. There was so much steel out there in the darkness that it seemed to Shilko as though the woods and meadows would sink under the weight. He worried that they would all become hopelessly intermingled when it came time to move, and, more seriously still, that his ability to displace due to both the trafficability problems and the unavailability of alternate sites would be dangerously restricted. The evening before, he and Romulinsky had conducted a reconnaissance, looking for alternate fire positions, but they had not found a single suitable piece of ground that was unoccupied. Now he was waiting for the division to whose divisional artillery group his battalion had been attached to designate alternate sites for his guns. In the meantime, he comforted himself with the thought that he was positioned in depth thanks to the long range of his pieces, and that the worst initial counterfires would be directed against batteries much closer to the direct fire battle than his own. But he still had difficulty maintaining an even temper when he imagined his battalion attempting to displace and sticking in the bogs and sodden byways of East Germany, unable even to make it across the border. He was certain of one thing: space in the roads was going to be at a premium. On the other hand, the initial fire plan in support of the opening of the offensive was just fine with him. Romulinsky's concerns notwithstanding, Shilko had been pleased when he reviewed the schedule of targets, his gift list to be sent to the enemy. The staff officers who had compiled it under the direction of the division commander and his chief of missile troops and artillery were clearly professionals. Shilko prided himself on the traditional professionalism of the Soviet and the earlier Russian artillery. This fire plan did it right, emphasizing concentrations of tremendous lethality at the anticipated points of decision, as well as on known and suspected enemy reserve and artillery concentrations, and in support of what Shilko suspected were deception efforts. The concept for maneuvering fires in support of the attack had a good feel to it. Now it was a matter of executing a good plan. Anything else, then, before we all go to war? Shilko asked. He tried his usual easy tone, but the word war did not come off with their intended lightness. The moment that would forever have to punctuate their lives had drawn too close. Well, we received another delivery of the special smoke rounds, Romulinsky said. I still don't see why we have to post so many guards on them. It's a waste of manpower, and we're short enough as it is. Romulinsky was speaking of the new obscurant rounds that had been compounded to attenuate the capabilities of enemy observation and target designation equipment. The existence and purpose of the rounds were well known, but the security personnel still insisted that they be handled as though they were vital state secrets. Be patient, Shilko said. We'll fire them up tomorrow, and then we won't have to guard them. He had learned long ago not to argue security issues. Have all the troops been fed? Romolinski nodded. He had an exaggerated manner of nodding, like a trained horse determined to please his master. I'm not certain it was the finest meal we ever served, but it was hot. Shilka was glad. He tried to feed his battalion as though they were all his own children, although it was very hard. Now he didn't want them going to war on empty stomachs. The food in the Soviet military was of legendarily poor quality, but his battalion's garrison farm was one of the finest in the command. Shilko himself came from peasant stock, and he was proud of it. In the past year, his battalion had been able to raise so many chickens that they were not only exceeded the official meat allocation per soldier, but were able to sell the chickens to other units for almost 5,000 rubles. His soldiers were better fed than those in any other battalion of which Shilko was aware, yet he used only 6 soldiers full-time in the agricultural collective, although each boy had been carefully selected because of his background and expertise. The brigade had gotten quite a bit of mileage out of their accomplishments of Shilko's gardeners, and their achievements had been featured in a military newspaper as an example to be emulated by all. It had been Shilko's finest hour with the high military authorities and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Shilko slipped into one of his old peasant attitudes. The party. He was in the habit of occasionally going down and working a bit with the soldiers in the garrison garden and poultry sheds. He had realized too late how much he loved the land and the animals and the sense of growing things, and he suspected that he had really been born to be a farmer, like his forefathers, but as a young man, he had viewed life on the collective farm as hopelessly drab and unsatisfying. Now, when he dug, the political officer got nervous. Publicly, Shilko received praise for his spirit of proletarian unity and his vigorous conformity to the essential principles of the party. In fact, however, he knew very well that it made the full-time party boys very nervous when lieutenant colonels took up shovels and hoes, afraid they might have to do a little proletarian duty themselves. Shilko had half expected to be denounced as a Maoist, and while he had never in fact been a full member of the party for 20 years, he had never taken his membership too seriously. It was something you did because you had to do it, like wearing the correct uniform for the occasion, but all the theory had been a bit too much for him. He liked things he could do with his hands. His son was another matter. Pasha had been a better mind than his father. He was clever and quick. Although he had been an enthusiastic young pioneer and a good komsomolist, Pasha had never immersed himself in the theoretical aspects of Marxism-Leninism to any unusual extent. He had simply accepted the party as a fact of life, as did most young men of reasonable ambition. Then he had come back, legless, from Afghanistan, to find himself last on the list for everything. No salutes for the boy without legs, and Shilko had watched his son turn from a loving, open youth into an extraordinarily dedicated member of the party. The party accepted Pasha, the invalid, seeking to exploit him even as they generally sought to help him. But Pasha had turned the full weight of his talents and his anger to exploiting the party. Shilko knew from experience that was the kind of ambition on which the party thrived. At first, upon his son's return, Shilko had worried that the practical aspects of his well-being. Then he watched the legless boy develop himself into a man with long arms. Pasha was doing very well within the party apparatus. He seemed to have developed a taste for manipulation, and Shilko had no doubt that his son would become a powerful man, that he would long ride the ribbons he had been given to compensate for his missing legs. Shilko no longer needed to worry about the mundane aspects of his son's welfare. Pasha would have a fine ground-floor apartment, or an apartment in a building where the elevator worked. But the simple, loving father in Shilko worried now about other aspects of his son's future. And in a matter of minutes, there would be a war. It still seemed unreal to Shilko, as though this could not possibly be a rational decision, but there was no mistaking the level of preparation, the intensity, the inevitability of it all. Shilko wondered if the decision to begin this war had been made by the kind of men his son was coming to resemble, the men who knew best for each and every living creature. Well, Shilko thought, it didn't matter. He and his boys would fight and fight well, no matter who made the decisions. The event was infinitely greater than the men caught up in it. The mood in the fire control post had begun to change. The frantic action tapered off. Officers began to sit down. Men looked up at the master clock above the communications bank. It would not be long now. Shoko looked at his watch, even though he had just glanced at the clock. He went to the samovar and tipped himself another cup of tea. Then he took his chair near the situation map, proofing the schedule of fires one last time. The radios were silent. Romolinski sat down beside Shilko and nervously patted the handle of the field telephone, the wires of which led directly to the gun batteries. Soon it would be time to pick them up and say the single word that would unleash the storm. Shilko was almost as proud of the big guns with which he had been entrusted as he was of his men. When he entered the service, his first unit had been equipped with field pieces designed before the Great Patriotic War, towed by Studebaker trucks from the war years. Now the enormous self-propelled pieces in his battalion made those little towed weapons seem like toys. Shilko felt that he had seen enormous progress in his lifetime. "Comrade Battalion Commander," Romolinski said, "you seem admirably relaxed." "The sleep did me good," Shilko said, content to wait and think through these last minutes. "But the Chief of Staff wanted to talk. I believe we are as ready as possible." Shilko accepted that the needs of other men were different from his own. If his Chief of Staff needed to talk him away the final minutes apiece, Shilko was willing to oblige him. "I'm confident that we're ready, Vasily Rodionovich. This is a good battalion. I have great faith. I can't help thinking, though, of things we should have done, of training that should have received more stress." Shilko waved the comment away. "No one is ever as prepared as they should be. You know the dialectic, a constant state of flux." "5 minutes," a voice announced. Shilko looked up at the clock, then he sat back. "You know," he began in his most personable voice, "when I was a junior lieutenant, I was horrified by the conditions I found upon my arrival at my first unit. Nothing seemed to be as we had even been promised at the academy. Nothing was as precise or as rigorous, or even as clean. I was very disturbed by what I viewed as a betrayal of the high standards of the Soviet military. Oh, I wasn't especially ambitious. I never expected to change the world, but this unit didn't seem as though it could go to war against a pack of dance hall girls. Half of the equipment didn't work. The situation seemed intolerable to a brand new lieutenant who had been coached to go up against the capitalist aggressors at a moment's notice. Anyway, my commander was a wise man, a veteran, of course. In those days, he watched my struggles with some amusement, I think. Then one day, he called me into his office. I was worried. It wasn't so common for a battalion commander to speak to a lieutenant in those days, and it usually didn't happen because the lieutenant had done something to be proud of. So I went to his office in quite a state. I couldn't think of anything I'd done incorrectly, but you never knew. Anyway, he asked me how I enjoyed being in the army, and how I liked the unit. He was teasing me, although I didn't realize it then. I talked around my real feelings. Finally, he just smiled and called me closer, very close to his desk. And he said he was going to reveal to me one military truth, and that if only I remembered it, I would do well in my military career. Shilko looked around. Everyone was listening to him, despite the unmistakable tension. The clock showed 2 minutes to go. Shilko grinned. You know what he said to me? He leaned over that desk so close I could see the old scars on his cheek, and he half whispered, "Shilko, wars are not won by the most competent army. They are won by the least incompetent army." His audience responded with pleasant laughter, but the undercurrent of anticipation had grown so intense now that no man could fully master it. The tension seemed almost like a physical wave, rising to sweep them all away. Romolinski gripped the field telephone, ready. Less than 1 minute to go. In the distance, a number of guns sounded. Startling in the perfect stillness, someone had fired early, either because of a bad clock or through nervousness. Shilko looked at the clock one final time. Other batteries and full battalions took up the challenge to the first lone battery, rising to a vast orchestra of calibers. Shilko turned to Romolinski, utterly serious now. "Give the order to open fire." Junior Lieutenant Plinikov. Oh, excuse me. Chapter 4. Junior Lieutenant Plinikov wiped at his nose with his fingers and ordered his driver forward. The view through the vehicle commander's optics allowed no meaningful orientation. Rapid flashes dazzled in the periscope's lens, leaving a deep gray veil of smoke in their wake. The view was further disrupted by raindrops that had found their way under the external cowl of the lens block. Plinikov felt as though he were guiding his reconnaissance track through hell at the bottom of the sea. The shudder of powerful artillery bursts reached through the metal walls of the vehicle. Suddenly, the armor seemed hopelessly thin, the tracks too weak to hold, and the automatic cannon little more than a toy. Occasionally, a tinny sprinkling of debris struck the vehicle, faintly audible through Plinikov's headset and over the engine whine. He could feel the engine pulling, straining to move the tracks through the mud of the farm trail. "Comrade Lieutenant, we're very close to the barrage," his driver told him. Plinikov understood that the driver meant too close, but the lieutenant was determined to outperform every other reconnaissance platoon leader in the battalion, if not the entire 2nd Guards tank army. "Keep moving," Plinikov commanded. "Just keep moving. Head straight through the smoke." The driver obeyed, but Plinikov could feel his unwillingness through the metal frame that separated them. For a moment, Plinikov took his eyes away from the periscope and looked to the side, checking on his gunner. But Belanov was all right, eyes locked to his own periscope. 3 men in a rolling steel box. There was no margin of safety in personnel now. Everyone had to do his job without fail. Plinikov had never received the additional soldiers required to fill out his reconnaissance platoon for war, and he had no extra meat, no dismount strength in his own vehicle. As it was, he could barely man the essential positions in each of his 3 vehicles. It was impossible to judge the exact location of his vehicle now. If everything was still on track, his 2nd vehicle would be tucked in behind him, with Senior Sergeant Malyarchuk to the rear in an overwatch position. Plinikov laughed to himself. Overwatch. You couldn't see 10 meters. He glanced at his map, anxious to orient himself. He could feel the trail dropping toward a valley or ravine. Artillery rounds struck immediately to the front. "Keep going," Plinikov said. "Get down into the low ground. Stay on the trail as long as the smoke holds. Fast! Now! Move!" Plinikov sensed that they were very close to the enemy. Clots of earth and stone flew into the air, hurtling across the narrowed horizon. Plinikov guessed that if he moved off the trail, there might be mines, but that the trail itself would only be covered by direct fires, which would be ineffective in the confusion of the Soviet artillery preparation. "Lieutenant, we're catching up with the barrage. We're too close. Keep going. We're already in it. Go right through." "Comrade Lieutenant," it was Junior Sergeant Belanov, his gunner, and assistant. The boy's face was milky. "It's all right," Plinikov told him through the intercom. "Just spot for targets. If we wait and try to sneak through, they'll get us for sure." An unidentified object thumped against the vehicle so hard that the vehicle jolted, as though wincing in pain. "Go faster," Plinikov shouted to the driver. "Just stay on the road and go as fast as you can. I can't see the road. I lose it." "Just go." Plinikov brushed his fingers at his nose. He felt fear rising in his belly and chest, unleashed by the impact of whatever hit the vehicle. Suddenly, the artillery blasts seemed to swamp them, shaking the vehicle like a boat on rough water. Plinikov realized that if they threw a track now, they were dead. "Go, damn you!" In the thick smoke, the lights of the blasts seemed demonic, alive with deadly intentions. "More to the left! To the left!" The track seemed to buckle on the edge of a ditch or gully, threatening to peel away from the road wheels. "Target!" Plinikov screamed. But the sudden black shape off to the right side was lifeless, its metal deformed by a direct hit. The driver swerved away and the tracks came level, back on the trail again. Plinikov broke out in a sweat. He had not seen the shattered vehicle until they had almost collided with it. He wondered for the first time if he had not done something irrevocably foolish. Slop from the nearby impact smacked the external lens of Plinikov's periscope, cracking it diagonally, just as the vehicle reached the pocket, where the wind had thinned the smoke to a transparent gauze. Several dark shapes moved out of the smoke on a converging axis. "Targets! Gunner! Right! Driver! Pull left, now!" But the enemy vehicles moved away quickly, either uninterested in or unaware of Plinikov's presence. The huge armored vehicles disappeared back into the smoke, black metal monsters roaming over the floor of hell. None of the turrets turned to fight. Hold fire! The enemy were evidently pulling off of a forward position. The fire was too much for them. Plinikov tried his radio, hoping the antenna had not been cut away. Javelin, this is Penknife. Do you hear me? Nothing. The heaviest fire struck behind him now, but the smoke, mingled with the fog and rain, still forced them to drive without points of orientation. Plinikov worried because he had once turned in a complete circle in a smokescreen on a training exercise, and the most embarrassing experience of his brief career. He could still hear the laughter and the time-worn jokes about lieutenants. Javelin, this is Penknife. I have a priority message. Penknife, this is Javelin. The control station barely came through the sea of static. Enemy forces in at least platoon strength are withdrawing from forward positions under fire strike. I can't give you an exact location. Where are you? What's your location? I'm in my assigned sector. Visibility's almost zero. We just drove under the artillery barrage. We're in among the enemy. You're hard to read. I'm getting a garbled transmission. Did you say you're behind the artillery barrage? On the enemy side of it, continuing to move. There was a long silence on the other end. Plinikov sensed that he had surprised them all. He felt a bloom of pride. Then the faint voice returned. Penknife. Your mission now is to push as far as you can. Ignore assigned boundaries. Just go as deep as you can and call targets. Do you understand? Clear. Moving now. Plinikov switched to the intercom. The smoke thinned slightly. His first instinct was to move for high ground so he could fix his location, but he quickly realized that any high ground would not only reveal his presence, but was likely to be occupied by the enemy. Driver, follow the terrain. Stay in the low ground. Just watch out for ditches and water. He switched again, this time to his platoon net, trying to raise his other two vehicles. Quiver, this is Penknife. He waited. No answer. He tried again and he still received no response. He swung the turret around to get a better view, straining to see through his cracked and dirty optics. There was nothing. Misty gray emptiness. Penknife, this is Stiletto, Plinikov heard Senior Sergeant Malyarchuk's voice. I can't hear any response from Quiver. My situation as follows. Moving slowly with the barrage. Can't see a damned thing. I lost you 20 minutes ago. This is Penknife. Clear transmission. Continue to move on primary route. Watch for Quiver. He may be stuck out there. End transmission. His other vehicle might be broken down or mired, but he realized it was more likely that they were dead. He was surprised to find that he felt little emotion and ashamed to experience how swiftly his thoughts turned to the implications the loss of the vehicle and crew had for him. Driver, get on the trail to the right. That one. The vehicle moved sharply now, with the worst effects of the barrage well behind it. Plinikov's optics had deteriorated severely. The crack on the outer lens allowed water to seep in. Slow. See the trail into the trees? Slow. Take the trail. The vehicle eased onto a smooth forest trail that appeared very well maintained. Plinikov hoped to find a spot to tuck into for a few minutes so they could clean off all their vision blocks and lenses and tighten the antenna. One barrage had already passed over the forest, and patches of trees had been splintered and blackened. The driver worked the tracks over a small fallen trunk. He drove the vehicle cautiously, with no desire to throw a track at such a close proximity to the enemy. Comrade Lieutenant, I can barely see, the driver said. Can I pop open my hatch? No, Plinikov said. Stop right here. I'll get out and clean the blocks. The vehicle rocked to a standstill. Plinikov unlatched the safety bolt and pushed up his hatch. The sudden increase in the noise level was striking. The weight of the artillery preparation was incredible, and the fire sounded much closer now. It was difficult to imagine anything surviving such an effort. In the wet green woods, fresh forest smells mingled with the stink of blown ordnance. Raindrops worked through the overhanging branches and struck Plinikov's nose and cheeks, touching cool at his lips. The hatch ring felt slimy with moisture and dirt. Just ahead, another trail crossed the one with which they had moved. The other trail was deeply rutted and black with mud, evidence that several tracked vehicles had passed along it. Plinikov drew himself back down into the turret. Belanov, he told the gunner, Make sure the autocannon's ready to go. I don't think we're alone. Comrade Lieutenant, just let me check the exterior. No, you stay on the gun. Just be ready. Plinnikov stripped off his headset and snaked out of the turret. The deck seemed to slide away under his boots, and he grasped the long, thin barrel of the automatic cannon to steady himself, crouching. The armament appeared to be all right, with no metal deformities, but there were numerous spots on the vehicle exterior where the paint had been stripped away and where the bolt-on armor had been gashed or even sheared away. One fender twisted towards the sky, an external stow box was gone, and the spare track pads were missing. The shovel was gone, the main antenna for the high-powered radio set was nicked, but functionally intact. Unidentifiable objects ripped through the foliage, their noises an occasional whisper. Big raindrops burst like shells in his skin. More rain coming. Plinnikov hurriedly cleaned all of his optics with a rag, trying not to smear them too badly. He got back into the turret as soon as he reasonably could. The trail looks clear enough up ahead, but you can't see very far. The enemy has either passed through these woods, or is still somewhere in here with us. Perhaps we should wait here for a while, Comrade Lieutenant. See what the enemy does, you know. Belanov was clearly frightened. Plinnikov hoped the gunner would be able to work his weapon when the time came. Plinnikov twitched his nose, then rubbed at it with his dirty knuckles. No. We have to get a fix on our location, and if we just sit, the artillery will roll back over us. We're moving. The truth was, Plinnikov realized, that he was afraid to remain motionless, afraid he couldn't handle the stress of inactivity. Driver, can you see all right now? Better, Comrade Lieutenant. Let's go. Nice and easy. Plinnikov wanted to make sure he spotted the enemy before they spotted his lone vehicle. He knew it would be impossible to detect moving vehicles until they were fatally close, due to the noise of the artillery preparation. The vehicle dug itself into the peat of the trail, then gripped and lurched forward. Plinnikov unlashed his assault rifle. He expected to fight with the automatic cannon and the onboard machine gun, but he wanted to be prepared for anything. He stood up behind the shield of his open turret, weapon at the ready, headset flaps left open so he could hear a bit of the world around him. The vehicle pivoted into the rutted trail. The rain picked up, slapping Plinnikov, making him squint. Nervously, he ejected a cartridge from his weapon, ensuring it was loaded and ready. Belanov, Comrade Lieutenant, how well can you see? I can see the trail. If I duck down and start turning the turret, be ready. I'm ready. Plinnikov heard the nerves in both their voices. He was furious about the lack of soldiers to fill out his crew. He wanted all of the fighting power he could get. He wished his lost vehicle was still with him. The track slid and plumed high mud into the air behind the vehicle. The immense roar of the artillery seemed part of another reality now, clearly divorced from anything that would happen in these woods. Black vehicle shapes, 30 meters through the trees. Plinnikov dropped into the turret, not bothering to close the hatch behind himself. He took control of the turret, forehead pressed against his optics. See them? Fire, damn you! Fire! The automatic cannon began to recoil. There, to the right! I have him. Driver, don't stop. Go! The vehicle pulled level with a small clearing in the forest where 2 enemy command tracks stood positioned with the drop ramps facing each other. 2 light command cars were parked to one side. A third track that had been hidden from view began to move for the trail. Hit the mover! Hit the mover! The automatic cannon spit several bursts at the track, which stopped in a shower of sparks. Driver, front to the enemy! Plinnikov swung the turret again. The enemy fired back with small arms. Although one man stood still, helmetless, in amazement, as though he had never in his life expected such a thing to happen. The automatic cannon and the machine gun raked the sides of the enemy tracks. All good, clean flank shots, punching through the armor. The track that had made a run for the trail burned now. The driver's hatch popped up. Plinnikov cut the man across the shoulders with the onboard machine gun. The man who had stood so long in the amazement slowly raised his hands. Plinnikov turned the machine gun on him. Plinnikov was afraid he would miss one of the dismounted soldiers, and he left the onboard weaponry to Belanov, standing behind the shield of his hatch with his assault rifle. Just in time, he saw an enemy soldier kneeling with a small tube in his shoulder. He emptied his entire magazine into the man, just as Belanov brought the machine gun around to catch him as well. Plinnikov pulled a grenade from his harness, then another. As quickly as his shaking fingers allowed, he primed one and tossed it towards the enemy vehicles, then followed it with the second grenade. He dropped back inside of his vehicle. The explosion sounded flat, almost inconsequential after the artillery barrage. Plennikov realized that his hearing was probably going. Sweep the vehicles one more time with the machine gun. Driver, to the rear, 10 meters. I can't see. Just back it up. Damn it, now. The gears crunched and the vehicle's tracks threw mud towards the dead and the dying. Driver, halt. Belanov. I'm going out. You cover me. He felt as though he would have given anything imaginable to have his authorized dismount scouts now. If there was a price to pay for the system's failure, he'd have to pay it. The idea did not appeal to him. He felt as though he were going very, very fast, as though he had the energy to vault over trees. But his hand shook as he grasped the automatic rifle. He didn't bother to unfold the stock. It was challenging enough to snap in a fresh magazine. It felt as though it took an unusually long time to work his way out of the turret. He was conscious every second of how fully he was exposed. As soon as he could, he swung his legs high and to the side, sliding down over the side of the low turret, catching his rump sharply on the edge of the vehicle's deck. He hit the mud and crouched beside the vehicle. Great clots of earth hung from the track and road wheels. He checked to his rear. Nothing. Forest. The empty trail. To his front, the little command cars blazed, one with the driver still behind the wheel, a shadow in the flames. Between his vehicle and the devastated enemy tracks, Plennikov could see 3 enemy soldiers on the ground. One of them moved in little jerks and twists. None of them made any sounds. Another body lay sprawled face down on the ramp of the command tracks, while yet another, the anti-tank grenadier, had been kicked back against a tree by the machine gun. The grenadier hardly resembled a human being now. The vehicle that had tried to escape burned with a searing glow in its metal. The type and markings made it Dutch. Plennikov kept well away from it as he worked his way forward. One of the command vehicles had its engine running. Both of the command tracks bore West German markings, and most of the uniforms were West German. Plennikov skirted to the front of the running vehicle, taking cover in the brush. As methodically as his nerves would permit, he maneuvered his way around the enemy's rear. He halted along the wet metal sidewall of the running vehicle, feeling its vibrations above the idling engine. He could hear the razzle of a radio call in a strange language. He wondered if it was a call for the station that had just perished. Someone moaned, almost as though he was snoring. Then it was quiet again. Plennikov breathed in deeply. He felt terribly afraid. He could not understand why he was doing this. It seemed as though he was meant to be anywhere but here. He looked at the grenadier's contorted remains. Somehow, it had all seemed a game. A daring game of driving through the artillery, and if he had been caught, he would have been removed from the game. But the man slopped against the tree was out of the game forever. For a length of time he could not measure. Plennikov simply stared at the tiny, black, red, and gold flag on the rear fender of the far vehicle, as though it could provide answers. He took a last deep breath, fighting his stomach. He pulled his weapon in tight against his side and threw himself around the corner of the vehicle onto the drop ramp. He had forgotten the dead man on the ramp. He tripped over the corpse, flopping over the body and smashing his elbow. He landed with his mouth close to the dead man's ear. In an instant of paralysis, he felt the lifelike warmth of the body through the battle dress and sogging rain. The dead man had fine white hairs mixed in with the close-cropped black on the rear of his skull, and Plennikov saw the red pores in the back of the man's neck with superhuman clarity. As soon as he could, Plennikov pushed off the corpse and twisted so that he could fire his weapon into the interior of the vehicle, but he knew that if anyone had still been capable of shooting, he would be dead already. The running vehicle bore a stew of bodies in its belly. The accidents of dying had thrown several men together as though they had been dancing and had fallen drunkenly. The inside of the cluttered compartment was streaked and splashed with wetness, and uniforms had torn open to spill filth and splinters of bone. Plennikov realized that some of the rounds had penetrated the near side of the vehicle that had not had the force to punch out the other side and had expended themselves in rattling back and forth inside the vehicle, chopping the occupants. In the track parked opposite, a lone radio operator sat sprawled over his notepads, microphone hanging limply from a coil cord. On the radio, a foreign voice called the dead. Plennikov was sick. He tried to make it to the trees out of some elementary human instinct, but he stumbled over the dead man on the ramp for a second time and vomited on the corpse's back. As he looked down at his mess, Plinikoff panicked to see blood smeared over his own chest before realizing it had come from his embrace of the middle-aged corpse. Plinikoff felt empty, his belly burning with acid and his heart vacantly sick. He stared at the slow progress of vomit down the angled ramp. He wanted to be home, safe, and never to see war or anything military ever again. He wiped the strands from his lips, wondering if his crew had watched his little performance. The taste in his mouth made him feel sick again. He realized belatedly that the amazed man with his hands up had been trying to surrender, and that it had been wrong to gun him down. But during the fighting, it had never occurred to him to do anything but shoot at everything in front of him. The voice on the radio called again. Plinikoff imagined that he could detect a pleading tone. Suddenly, he braced himself. He stared at the silver ornaments on the epaulets of the corpse on the ramp. This was a command post. There would be documents, maps, radio communications data. Stomach twisting, Plinikoff turned to his task. Senior Lieutenant Filov failed to grasp what was happening until it was too late. He brought his company of tanks online behind the smokescreen, moving at combat speed toward the enemy, maintaining reasonable order despite his spiky nervousness. Then the tanks began to sink in what had appeared to be a normal field. Reconnaissance had not reported any difficulties. Now his command tanks stood mired to the deck, and none of his vehicles succeeded in backing out. Their efforts only worked them deeper into the marshy soil. His entire company had ground to a halt in a tattered cartoon of their battle formation. Filov attempted to call back through the battalion for more smoke and for recovery vehicles, but the smoke screen began to dissipate noticeably. Before he could establish radio contact, the nets were cluttered with strange voices. Prepare to engage, he shouted into his microphone. When his platoon commanders failed to respond, he realized with a feeling of near panic that he had been speaking only through the intercom. He switched channels, fingers clumsy on the control mechanism, and repeated his orders. "Misha, I'm stuck," one of his platoon commanders responded. "We're all stuck. Use your call sign, and mine, and use your head." Filov tried to raise battalion again. Without more smoke, they'd be dead. Filov was sure the enemy had trapped them, that this was a clever ambush and that enemy anti-tank gunners were waiting to destroy them. The smoke continued to thin. Nothing on the battalion net. It was as though the battalion had vanished from the earth. Filov's gunner, a Muslim from Uzbekistan, was praying. Filov slapped him hard on the side of his headset. "God won't help you, bastard. Get on your gun sight." Flares popped hot bright through the last meager smoke. From the angle of their arc, Filov could tell that none of his people had fired them. In any case, the use of flares was inappropriate. Even with the rain and smoke, there was still plenty of light. Probably a distress signal, Filov thought, but he had no idea who could have fired. He tried the battalion net again, begging the electronics to respond. The gun tube of his tank was so low to the ground that it barely cleared the wild grasses. Filov wondered if they could dig themselves out. He knew how to recover tanks in a classroom when the problem allowed nearby trees, but now they were stuck dead center in a meadow. He was about to order all of his vehicles to begin erecting their camouflage nets and to send one of his lieutenants back on foot to locate the rest of the battalion when the last smoke blew off. The battlefield showed its secrets with painful clarity, the light rain and mist offering no real protection. Less than 500 meters from his line of tanks, set at an angle, Filov saw 5 enemy tanks. The enemy vehicles were also bogged down, almost to the turrets. "Fire!" Filov screamed, paying no attention to which channel he was riding, forgetting all fire discipline and procedures. His gunner dutifully sent off a round in the general direction of the enemy. Filov tried to remember the proper sequence of fire commands. He began to turn the turret without making a decision on which enemy vehicle to engage. The enemy fired back. Filov's entire line fired, in booming disorder. Nobody seemed to hit anything. Filov settled on a target. "Loading Sabo, range 450. The automatic loader slammed the round into the breech. "Correct to 400. Ready. Fire." The round went wide despite the ridiculously short distance to the target. but another one of the enemy vehicles disappeared in a bloom of sparks, flame, and smoke under the massed fires of Filov's right flank platoon. Filov's headset shrieked with broken transmissions. I've lost one! I've lost one! Range 500! Wrong net, you son of a bitch! The enemy tanks fired as swiftly as they could, their rounds skimming through the marshy grasses. Filov could not understand why he could not hit his targets. He had always fired top scores on the range, perfect fives. He tried to slow down and behave as though he were back on a local gunnery range. Filov's gunner sent another round toward the enemy tank. This time it struck home. The enemy tank failed to explode. After a bright flash, the big angular turret was still there, settling back down as though its sleep had been disturbed, but the vehicle's crew began to clamber out through the hatches, clumsy in their haste. Out of the corner of his field of vision, Filov saw the turret of one of his own tanks fly high into the air as though it were no heavier than a soccer ball. Then another enemy tank flared up, open in a fuel tank fire. It was too much. Filov opened his hatch and scrambled out. This was insane. Murder. All of his visions collapsed inward. His headset jerked at his neck and he tore it off. He stumbled down over the slippery deck of his own tank, then abandoned his last caution and jumped for the grass. He saw other men running across the field in the distance. It was all senseless to stay. For what? They'd all die, just to shoot until they all killed each other. What would it accomplish? The whisk and thunder of the tank battle continued behind him, punctuated occasionally by the metallic ring and blast of a round meeting its target. The sopping marshland clutched at Filov's boots. In his panic, he began smashing at his legs, as though he could slap them into cooperation, as if he could beat the earth from underfoot. He ran without looking back. Plinikov stood up in his hatch, fumbling to ready the smoke grenade. He heard the helicopter before he saw it. The weather had an odd effect on the sound, diffusing it against the background of the artillery barrage so that it was difficult to identify the exact azimuth of the aircraft's approach. All at once, just offset from Plinikov's line of sight, the small helicopter emerged from the mist, a quick blur that swiftly grew larger and began to define itself. Plinikov tossed the smoke canister so that the wind would lead the colored fog away from his vehicle. He could tell immediately that the pilot was one of the Afghansi, a real veteran, by the way he came in fast and very low. Despite the rain of reduced visibility, the pilot never really powered down. His co-pilot leapt from the settling aircraft and raced through the drizzle, bareheaded. Plinikov jumped from his track, clutching the rolled maps and documents. The maps and some of the papers were stained with blood and the spillage of ripped bodies, and Plinikov was anxious to be rid of them. He held them out to the aviator like a bouquet. "Anything else?" the co-pilot shouted. The wash off the rotor's half submerged his voice. Plinikov shook his head. The smoke spread out in the shredded carpet across the green field. The enemy would see it too, and there was no time to waste. The co-pilot raced back to his helicopter. He hurriedly tossed the captured materials behind his seat, and the pilot began to lift off even before his partner was properly seated. The aircraft rose just enough to clear the trees, then shot off in a dogleg from its approach direction. Plinikov vaulted onto the deck of his vehicle, almost losing his balance on the slippery metal. He dropped into the turret. "Let's move, back into the woods." The vehicle whined to life, rocking out across the furrows of the field until it could turn nose back into the trail between the trees. Plinikov studied his map again, searching for a good route deeper into the enemy's rear. No obvious routes suggested themselves, and his calculations began to seem hopelessly complicated to him. In irritation, he ordered the driver to double back onto the trail that had proven so lucrative earlier, hoping a course would be easier to develop while working through the actual landscape than it was on the map. At a trail crossing, he turned the map for reference. It was a very high-quality map with extensive military detail, but it almost seemed as though the trails in the German woods created themselves out of nothing, as though the forest were haunted. He chose the trail that seemed to head west. At first it was a fair dirt track, then the forest began to close in. Plinikov found himself pushing wet branches away from the vehicle. His uniform was already soaking and uncomfortable, and his spirits dropped suddenly, as though someone had pulled a cork. "Depress the gun tube. It's catching the branches. Driver, go slowly." Then Plinikov's fortune seemed to change. The trees thinned again, and the terrain began to began to show slight undulations. A hollow off to his right discharged a small stream that flowed parallel to the track. He checked his map again, hoping the feature and the trail, side by side, would allow him to orient himself, but he could not identify his location. The only possibilities on the map didn't really seem to make sense in the terms of the distance he estimated they had traveled. He needed a clear landmark, or an open view. Through all of the trials, Plinikov tried not to think of the dead enemy, told their creeping, insistent reality at a distance. He sought harmless thoughts, gleaning his memories of the military academy and the seemingly endless dilemmas of the lieutenancy that had followed his graduation, but all of the forced images faded into the vivid sights, sounds, and smells of the recent combat. He could not help refighting the action over and over again, scrutinizing his failures. The dead men died again and again, their reality already changing slightly, as though warping and mutating in his overheated memory. Unexpectedly, the forest halted. The vehicle lay fully exposed where Plinikov ordered it to halt. He stood off the last of his daydreams. A church spire rose above the copse of trees, dark against the low gray sky. He wiped the back of his fingers across his nose and reached down for his map. He neither saw nor heard the round that killed him. It tore into the hull of a vehicle below the turret, ripping off his lower legs and mincing his hands as it exploded. The quick secondary blast shot his torso up through the commander's hatch, breaking his neck against the hatch rim and shattering his back as the pressure compressed his body through the circular opening and blew it into the sky like a bundle of rags.